Dear participants, good afternoon. On behalf of the Livenarch Committee, we would like to warmly welcome you all to this conference, Livenarch VII, Other Architectures. Now it's time for the keynote speaker to give her speech. Esra Akcan's research on modern and contemporary architecture and urbanism foregrounds the intertwined histories of Europe and West Asia and offers new ways to understand architecture's role in global social and environmental justice. Her book, Architecture in Translation, advocates a commitment to a new culture of translatability from below and multiple directions for cosmopolitan ethics and global justice. Turkey, Modern Architectures in History with Bozdoğan is part of a series that aims at an inclusive survey of modern world architecture. Open architecture, migration, citizenship, and urban renewal exemplifies formal, programmatic, and procedural steps towards open architecture during Berlin's urban renewal by giving voice to both architects and immigrant residents. Akcan is also the author of Landfill, Istanbul and Building Exile, Burnout in Turkey with Nikolai, and the upcoming Abolish Human Bands. Currently, she is writing Right to Heal, Architecture in Post-Conflict and Post-Disaster Societies. Her articles explore critical and post-colonial theory, immigration, translation, racism, architectural photography, neoliberalism, and global history. So please join me in welcoming Esra Akcan.
Çok teşekkürler. Merhabalar herkese. Öncelikle beni davet ettiğiniz için çok teşekkür ederim. İngilizceye döneceğim şimdi, konuşma İngilizce ama herkese selamlar ve çok teşekkürler. Önce bir ekranımı paylaşayım. Evet, ekranımı görebildiğinizi ümit ediyorum. Ses gelmedi, herhalde görüyorsunuz. İngilizceye dönüyorum. This lecture is called Architecture and Human Rights. Ever since the concept of human rights crystallized with the 18th century people's revolutions, it has implicitly become a reference point in discussions about space. In the field of architecture, the notion of human rights is prone to generate discussions on class, gender, race, and citizenship discrimination, as well as different architectural programs, including urban space, housing, schools, public monuments, memorials, and museums. So this lecture is divided into three parts. The first is on the theoretical framework concerning architecture and human rights in general, and the last two on the relevance of architecture for the human rights of two subjects, the refugee and the victim of past violations. Both of these subjects have been rendered other by their societies, the current human rights framework, as well as the established architectural institutions. Both of them are also central for the contemporary debates in Turkey, a country whose human rights record has been, and it's increasingly becoming, abysmal. So part one, but what exactly are human rights? Despite its omnipresent use in daily language, the definition of rights as a concept has not been settled easily and remains unresolved. The concept of human rights has received its own share of suspicion and reproach from authors at different ends of the political spectrum. The far-right press around the world portray human rights as an alibi to protect criminals and constrain governments from punishing them. In Turkey, human rights are portrayed as a cultural imperialist plot to weaken the Turkish state. Historically speaking, Jeremy Bentham ridiculed the foundational premise of human rights that all human beings are born free. Perhaps this is to be expected from the inventor of panoptic prisons who attempted to discipline bodies through an architectural device. Bentham ridiculed the idea that natural and inalienable rights should be distinct from legal rights because he claimed that would be an invitation to anarchy. On the opposite side of this political spectrum, Karl Marx also famously opposed human rights for their egoistic preoccupations that protect individuals instead of political communities, and for reducing the definition of the true human being into a bourgeois. As early as Olympe de Gouges or Mary Wollstonecraft's appeals, feminist critique has also exposed the hypocrisy of gender discrimination in the initial declarations that advocated for the rights of quote-unquote man and citizen. Another common objection has been the assertion that the concept of human rights is a Western invention and therefore its universalization and imperialist expansion. This is an accusation that Amartya Sen defined as cultural critique, but also rejected. Episodes when Western superpowers used human rights as an excuse for military intervention to serve their other interests stand as the worst scandals in human rights history. So with some of these faults corrected, but others left unresolved, the concept of human rights continues to be relevant today for moral commitment to rectify injustice and ensure equality, or political action to protect human dignity, enable participatory democracy, and foster progressive change. And it's also relevant for the education of the senses to build empathy for the oppressed. So despite numerous challenges from skeptics and authors with different moral philosophical convictions that I just mentioned, the claim to natural rights has never been quite defeated, as Margaret MacDonald summarizes. Human rights tends in some form to be renewed in every crisis in human affairs when the plain citizen tries to make or expects his leaders to make articulate his obscure but firmly held conviction that he's not a mere pawn in any political game, nor the property of any government or ruler, but he is the living and protesting individual. This was a quotation. So against this background, I would like to focus on the under-acknowledged role of human rights in architectural theory by foregrounding both its emancipatory potentials and continuing limits. Of the current human rights framework, I would like to extend the human rights framework. Even though the topic of human rights is relevant for multiple social sciences and humanities fields, it has been overwhelmingly perceived as a legal matter administered by the United Nations after the second half of the 20th century. The perception of human rights as an exclusively legal and governmental matter assumes that there should be a responsible institution whose duty is to deliver human rights. And it operates as if something could be defined as a human right only if it can be combined with a correlating obligation. This may be important in the implementation of human rights, but it has narrowed down the epistemological, ethical, and cultural discussions about the topic. Narrowly speaking, the legal debate on human rights has paid attention to architecture only in relation to the right to housing. Ever since the first deliberations at the United Nations that resulted in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there has been an international discord over what constitutes a human right. Housing has been one of them. Article 25 reads, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services. The UN Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights gives a vague definition to adequate housing, which involves security, availability of services, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. However, the government's obligations as to what level these standards should be provided are unclear, and the evaluation criteria for states that fail to keep up with these obligations are even less defined. Even though the UN admits that the situation of housing around the world is dire, housing in particular, or architecture in general, has not necessarily become a top priority of human rights. Preventing discrimination, preventing forced evictions, and war crimes, including the unjustified destruction of housing, have come to be the only legal human rights considerations in international institutions when it comes to architecture. This lecture suggests to cast a wider net. Before I move on to my own books about this topic, let me briefly mention the author that comes first to one's mind when the issue of rights and architecture are concerned. There is indeed hardly any other text that has received more acknowledgement in the architectural discipline than Henri Lefebvre's The Right to the City. This text has served as a guide, or sometimes as a slogan, to reflect on architecture's relation to uneven development in the capitalist city. One of the most distinguishing features of this text is Lefebvre's definition of the city's architecture with use value as opposed to exchange value. Consequently, the city's architecture becomes the platform for revolutionary transformation, if only it could be preserved from being quantified into exchange value. Like Karl Marx, Lefebvre posits the working class as the principal agent of revolutionary transformation. Yet, unlike Marx, Lefebvre includes the realization of human rights in this transformation as well. He defines the right to the city not as a simple visiting right or as a return to traditional cities, but rather as a transformed and renewed right to urban life, where use value, not exchange value, is priority. It follows that Lefebvre is invested in the city's right to exist beyond the capitalist market logic, so that it can be returned to its users, to the citizens who can perform their human rights. But what about the rights of the city dweller who is not a citizen? In the age of global capitalism, where the Western superpowers rely on the labor of non-Western immigrant workers, a primary locus of discussion for both human rights and critical theory needs to be the non-citizen workers, whose lack of rights exposes the paradox of the current human rights regime. And this is why the concept of immigration and the figure of the refugee should now be at the forefront of the human rights debate. And this was the topic of my book, Open Architecture, and also the topic of the second part of this lecture, right to have rights. So urban discourse often refers to city areas whose populations have a high percentage of immigrants as ghettos, in the sense of sources of trouble, crime, and chaos, and as something to be obliterated. Countless examples abound to substantiate the racialization of and discrimination against immigrant workers and refugees through urban policy. A good case in point is the guest worker program, quote unquote, guest worker program in Germany after 1961, and IBA 1984-87 as one of the most world famous urban renewal and public housing initiatives of the 20th century. This IBA employed over 200 established and up-and-coming architects from Europe and North America. During the 1960s and 70s in Berlin, the immigrant workers from Turkey were pushed to the war-torn Kreuzberg district, where landlords did not perform legally required maintenance, since immigrant or non-citizen families could hardly make official complaints about the decaying state of their apartments. Many other social practices took advantage of the immigrants' lack of rights. Toilet decrees explaining how to handle human waste, foreigner classes segregating the education of German and Turkish children, newspaper advertisements that made it clear that immigrants were not eligible to rent apartments, and other measures all made clear the social separation and othering of Turkish guest workers. Civil society groups protecting the rights of immigrants saw themselves as organizations against racism and fascism together. This reflected in the legal sphere too. The Berlin Senate passed a series of housing laws and regulations. Among the most consequential ways that racialized categories impacted IBA's urban renewal of Kreuzberg were the discriminatory housing laws and regulations, with serious consequences for the Turkish guest workers or non-citizens. The ban on entry and settlement, for instance, prohibited the movement of immigrant families to Kreuzberg, Wedding, and Tiergarten, additional movement. The so-called desegregation regulations mandated that only 10% of units be rented to immigrants all over West Berlin. In other words, if there was a Turkish family living in one apartment of a 10-unit building, no new immigrant family could move into that building. These discriminatory housing laws and regulations instituted by the Berlin Senate were transposed into the functional program of the new buildings to be built by IBA, the Kreuzberg's Urban Renewal Agency, in the form of the percentage of large flats, which would have been fitting for these migrant families. Even though the percentage of non-citizens reached 50% in many areas of Kreuzberg, the Senate mandated that only 5, maximum 10% of new units would be big apartments. So this program, in other words, would either diminish non-citizen families' chances to move into the new buildings or welcome them only after they change their lives to fit the German family size standards. So Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reads, "Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state." Accordingly, the Berlin Senate's laws were violations of human rights and could not have been instituted for citizens. Moreover, during the time that these regulations were put in place, it was procedurally impossible for guest workers from Turkey to have fulfilled the immigration requirements and become naturalized, which meant that the laws and regulations consciously targeted this immigrant population by taking advantage of the citizenship law. The collapsibility of race and non-citizen conveniently served to exert discrimination under the pretext of law. So, and that is how the notion of migration and racism is connected to human rights. So in my book, Open Architecture, I analyze architectural practices that were either complicit or naively ignorant or ironic or subversive of these discriminatory housing regulations instituted by the Berlin Senate. And I identified formal, programmatic, and procedural ways of designing open architecture that would protect the immigrants' human rights. So let me give 4 examples showing how race as a racialized category functions in architectural projects and sometimes to a perpetuating, at other times to a subversive effect. For instance, while reducing the non-citizens' chances to move into the new buildings, IBA designated some formal experiments specifically as guest worker and refugee zones, such as Block 1, designed by Oswald Matthias Ungers. Big apartments were provided in an unusually small and squeezed courtyard that prioritized geometric ambitions over actual habitation. The 9-square plan in here creates a square courtyard at the center of a square building composed of 8 square towers served by 4 square stairwells, all placed in a city block divided into a square grid with all 4 facades composed of square windows, and the 8 freestanding square towers are bridged on the 4th floor above the square surface with 9 square perforations on 3 floors. In other words, the design was much more a formal experiment than one that cared for the habitants. And it is perhaps not a surprise that it was located at one of the zones specifically reserved for immigrants. To show another type of relation between architectural form and assumptions about ethno-racial identity of the immigrants, in one of the earliest projects that exemplify the perimeter block idea, Rob Krier prepared the urban design of a network of perimeter blocks that created additional streets and an urban plaza at the intersection. This was also meant to illustrate the idea of collaboration, as 20 different architectural firms from Europe and North America undertook different parts of the overall design. The block also represented Rob Krier's ideas about the relation between nation and form. When the design of individual apartments are concerned, Krier took the issue of immigration seriously, but in ways that perpetuated an essentialist link between architectural form and racial identity. He declared to have designed the units of this housing specifically for Turkish families by making references to the perceived typologies of the Turkish house as a vernacular form. To give an example of an ironic approach, in an invited international architectural competition, Ram Koolhaas suggested different urban fabrics for each block and refused to comply with IBA's rules to create perimeter buildings around the blocks. Like a salon de refusés, Koolhaas collaged previously rejected architecture proposals from East and West Berlin onto his design in an act of subversion that preemptively embraced rejection as a way to stay outside the establishment. After predictably losing the competition, OMA, with Kola, Zengelis, and Sauerbu, OMA was given a much smaller site, which was introduced in a professional magazine as follows, I'm quoting, OMA imagined that a section through the building would present a section through West Berlin, allies at the base, followed at the middle levels by larger units to be taken up by Turkish guest workers and their families, with Germans living in small units at the top. So making immigrants visible on an urban facade took a critical stance against the anti-immigration policies of the time, but only by having to stamp their apartments as territories of the stateless. Finally, let me emphasize a subversive example. Another group of architects known as IBA Altbau team, under the direction of Hart Walter Hemmer, mobilized tenant organizations, squatter demonstrations, refugee and guest worker participation to carry out a radically democratic urban renewal. In this section, the team prepared countless handouts to explain the renewal process to the residents and organized building meetings for each and every building in order to record and negotiate the residents' conflicting and complementing requirements. The tenant advisors working in newly established tenant consulting agencies went door to each and every apartment to discuss the residents' needs and budgets. The translators found on the streets and universities were employed. The architects removed or added walls, combined or divided units, and added stairs and service spaces to optimize the neighboring tenants' different needs within their budgets. The developers agreed to some low-profit deals for the prestige of working here. The residents participated in the construction. They also agreed to move temporarily to another apartment when the renewal was going on. The authorities agreed to give public housing status to residents for approximately 25 years, so that no single non-citizen family was unwillingly displaced from their apartment, keeping the original percentage of immigrants in the area intact. Thus, the Berlin Senate's 10% mandate and discriminatory laws were subverted by a group of professionals employed by the Senate itself. And you may read about these buildings in much more detail, as well as the book's other main argument that I will not be presenting today. The book also showed the agency of these immigrants in the making of the architectural and urban spaces that we assumed had been created by white male architects. Through oral histories and on-site analysis, I recorded how the immigrants shaped Kreuzberg into what it is now by appropriating and changing their apartments and social spaces. So for our purposes today, let me turn back to the theory of human rights that this example invites us to elaborate on. The lack of citizenship rights and the legal loophole for discrimination that took place during Kreuzberg urban renewal is a typical case showing the paradoxes of the current human rights regime as it reflects on housing and urbanism. Giorgio Agamben revisited Hannah Arendt's text, We Refugees, written in response to the biggest refugee crisis during the World War II, precisely because statelessness continues to be prolific today and simultaneously exposes the limits of the modern institutions in securing human rights. In another text, Arendt did not fail to notice that housing is the first major human right lost to the refugee. The stateless puts into question the limits of the human rights that presume the condition of being a citizen of a state. Ever since the first Declaration of Rights, the link between natural and civil rights, man and citizen, birth and nationhood, has continued to define human rights, making it impossible to have rights without citizenship. A refugee who loses citizenship status in a country would immediately recognize that the natural rights of being a human, the rights that human beings should have by virtue of being born, are actually unprotected unless one belongs to a nation state. The paradox here, wrote Agamben, is that the very figure that should have embodied the rights of man par excellence, the refugee, signals instead the concept's radical crisis. It is important to remember that people have been excluded from citizenship throughout the history of citizenship. Slaves, women, colonial subjects, guest workers, legal aliens, undocumented immigrants, and refugees have all been identified as non-citizens at some point in the past, and some of them continue to be identified in this way today. Moreover, when applied to the notion of social citizenship, non-citizens also include people excluded from citizenship because of a socially constructed notion of class, race, gender, ethnicity, or religion. By social citizenship rights, I mean T.H. Marshall's definition: the rights tied to economic welfare and security, such as insurance against unemployment, rights to healthcare, education, housing, and a pension. People who were once non-citizens often continue to be denied social citizenship even after naturalization, as the exclusion of former slaves, colonial subjects, or guest workers is projected onto the present in the form of class difference and white supremacy today. Balibar also theorizes about the relation between internal and external exclusions from citizenship, in order to understand the mechanism that denies legal citizens the right to have rights. An external border is mirrored by an internal border, he writes, to such an extent that citizenship becomes a club to which one is admitted or not, regardless of one's legal rights. So today, Kreuzberg is undergoing a wave of gentrification, which is again threatening to displace the former non-citizens from their apartments. This is another reason why public housing and housing as a human right must be at the forefront of discussions about social citizenship today, as the decline of welfare system with the advance of neoliberalism puts public housing at even greater risk. The concept of citizenship has historically been in constant evolution as women and former slaves and colonial subjects gained rights over time. It ought to continue to change as refugees and global migrants remain rightless. The question for the present today is how architects will find forms and ways of practicing an architecture that protects the human rights of non-citizens as much as citizens. And let me now move to the last subject that I will foreground to discuss the relation between architecture and human rights. After the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the United Nations Human Rights Commission continued to add new treatises that are open to member states' ratification. Initially, the first two covenants aimed to resolve the ideological split between the Cold War superpowers that prevented to include all rights under one treaty. As the number of member states increased during the decolonization process of the 1960s and responding to several social movements around the globe, the UN added new conventions, such as the ones on the elimination of racial discrimination and of discrimination against women, as well as the Convention Against Torture and the Rights of the Child. One of the two new treatises adopted in 2006 was the Convention on the Protection from Enforced Disappearance, which also defines a right to truth. This recent Human Rights Convention has opened up new potentials for architecture. Even though enforced disappearance, which means not returning from state custody due to possibly a torture or a secret murder, even though this existed for a long time, the United Nations and Amnesty International have warned that the practice actually increased and spread over the world after 1980, with systematic cases in Argentina, Chile, China, East Germany, Guatemala, Iraq, Russia, Spain, Sri Lanka, Turkey, USA, and many others. In 2014, the UN reported more than 43,000 unresolved cases of disappearances in 88 different states. In Turkey, Saturday Mothers has built one of the most important and long-lasting social movements against enforced disappearance. Those subject to enforced disappearance expose how modern states turn bodies into what George Agamben called bare life, in the sense that states hold the power to deprive citizens of their political rights and push them outside the realm that should have been protected by citizen rights. Turning humans into bare lives gives those states necropower. As Eşil Membe coined the term, it gives statecrafts a license, a presumed right to kill with impunity. Enforced disappearance also opened a sphere in international law and human rights debate known as transitional justice. The accountability for past abuses came to the forefront of human rights movements with the grassroots protests against enforced disappearance, such as the one by Mothers of Plaza de Mayo starting in 1977. The concept of transitional justice entered the lexicon of international law as new nations emerged out of the end of Cold War and with conflicts in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The official UN definition released in 2004 when Kofi Annan was Secretary General reads, transitional justice is the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempts to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abuses in order to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation. I suggest to analyze transitions from military regimes, civil wars, genocides, apartheids, as well as reparations to heal from colonization and slavery as topics of the multidisciplinary field of transitional justice. The right to truth is one of these goals that oversees the right of relatives and society to know the truth about state brutality and human rights violations in the past, which have been obscured due to denial of responsibility and distortion of facts in official national histories. Truth and recognition of suffering is a prerequisite of healing. As Michael Ignatieff put it, the new human rights culture has been accompanied by the global diffusion of the psychoanalytic idea about the healing power of truth. Architecture has a newfound but untapped relevance in this new theory of human rights. This involves both retrospective and prospective mechanisms, such as uncovering the evidences by treating physical environments as primary sources of history in truth commissions, and forward-looking restorative platforms such as memorials and museums, apology museums. A multidisciplinary study of human rights needs to both locate spaces of political harm and make a call to repurpose them as healing spaces. I would like to define architectural programs and spaces of reparation as healing spaces where political harm and human rights violations are confronted. For the first category, meaning the role of architectural history in uncovering evidences of human rights violations of the past, the work of forensic architecture is an excellent example. Architecture is transformed into a sensor here for social and political activity and used as evidence to record the past. Forensic architecture's work not only expands the nature and definition of evidence in architectural history, but also amplifies the voice of the victim by giving it a material evidence. But let me give an example from the country where our conference is located. So what are the spaces of political harm, and can they be repurposed as healing spaces in Turkey? The answer, of course, is many, and we need to look at the missing evidences and marks that regimes erase to hide their violent crimes. That is why, in my own work, I turn to the stories of those who search for the missing bones of their disappeared relatives, such as the Saturday mothers. I also turn to the disappearing and hidden graveyards. The center of modern Istanbul, the broader Taksim zone, is indeed one such area where two major cemeteries have disappeared. Mehmet Kentel has already analyzed the disappearance of the Muslim small cemetery during Pera's transformation from a land of grapes and graves to a city of elite households and hotels during the Ottoman Empire's integration into capitalism. The other cemetery around today's Taksim and Gezi Park used to be the site for non-Muslim graves. After the cholera epidemic and pressured by the real estate, the new land law of 1869 dictated to carry all cemeteries to the outskirts. Despite some public dissent, municipal authorities negotiated the relocation of Catholic, Protestant, and Greek Orthodox graves. The map of 1858 clearly shows the Greek cemetery at the entrance of today's Istiklal Street and the Catholic and Protestant cemeteries to the north of the Ottoman military artillery. The same map of 1882 no longer shows these cemeteries and replaces them with public gardens. Yet the Armenian cemetery remains in both maps. Following a couple attempts to expropriate the Armenian Surp Agop cemetery and its church since 1855, the negotiations had remained unresolved when World War I broke. After the Ottoman Empire dissolved, the Turkish Republic confiscated the land in 1939 through unjustified but so-called legal means by manipulating the transition between imperial and national legal regimes and denying the Armenian Patriarch lawful ownership of the land. Such dispossessions of Armenian property whose owners have been deported, exiled, or murdered has been part of the denial statecraft and continued climate of impunity. The Gezi Park and Intercontinental Hotel stand today on the older site of the relocated Catholic and Protestant cemeteries, while the Divan and Hyatt hotels, as well as a series of modern buildings, stand on the older site of the confiscated Armenian cemetery. So my point is, architectural history can be mobilized to show evidence of human rights violations in the past and call on the society to confront and heal these wounds. For the second category, the role of architecture in prospective justice, transitional justice memorials and museums provide one of the good examples for healing spaces. A lot has been said about reconstruction of cities and memorials after wars, but the trauma inflicted by internal perpetrators have hardly been confronted. Violence by rulers, sciences, and institutions that are meant to protect the individuals on whom they impose conflict and disaster. Unlike those that prompted museums critiqued that there's nothing as invisible as a monument, transitional justice memorials should no longer be sculptures on a handful of heroes on pedestals, but complex conceptions of sites where sculpture, architecture, landscape, design, earth art, performance, and educational programs might be combined. Transitional justice memorials differ from war memorials because they expose a state's accountability for past crimes and participate in reparations to heal from these traumas. Official state monuments had manipulated collective memory by overemphasizing and stabilizing the dominant voice and thus by taking part in cultural repression. In contrast, transitional justice memorials and museums amplified the victim's experience rather than the victor's propaganda. They can be located in both found and constructed sites, namely both spaces where the trauma happened and the symbolic spaces that would be associated with healing by virtue of the memorial. They are not monuments to single leaders, but to healing ideas and values. However, architects are usually excluded from the decisions over the needs, site, representatives, and narrative of these memorials. Architects are only brought in at the last stage to design the physical environment. In this lecture, I would like to call on us to formulate a more proactive role by arguing that architects can indeed contribute to transitional justice when a healing space's decisions about site, form, program, narrative are concerned. The question for the present is how architects will find forms and ways of giving forward momentum to healing from human rights violations. And these examples suggest, architecture's understudied intersection with human rights evolves with the changing human rights, and it contributes to the discourse of human rights by carrying it beyond the legal sphere. In this lecture, I foregrounded the role of architectural history in right to truth, as well as architectural programs such as urban spaces, housing, public monuments, memorials and museums as healing spaces after human rights violations. Needless to say, many other architectural programs and policies are relevant for the actualization of rights to training, education, work, culture, health, housing. Reflecting on these concepts has also carried me to the conclusion about the necessity to both globalize and localize the human rights debates and to keep it continually open and self-reflective platform. A familiar critique of human rights regime and the international organizations such as UN is their inaugural Eurocentrism and hierarchical structure. However, this critique needs to be qualified with two considerations. The conception that human rights were invented in the West is counterfactual because there was a network of Enlightenment revolutions in the 18th century when the concept of human rights emerged. Non-Western revolutions were some of the major chronological markers, such as the Haitian Constitution of 1805 that abolished slavery. The claim that only Western philosophical tradition prepared the theory of human rights sounds offensive to many ears, as if values such as human fulfillment, dignity, and equality could not be found in Confucian, Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic, and many other world teachings. Historically, the concept of human rights had been mobilized and improved in several episodes for anti-colonial, anti-racist, feminist, anti-slavery, and anti-apartheid struggles. Today, the assumption that the torch of human rights is carried by Western nations is also counterfactual. US, for instance, has only signed 5 out of the 18 UN Human Rights Conventions. The grassroots struggles and the writing of the international conventions to bring justice to historical crimes that I discussed today constitute examples that human rights activism and international legislation today is taking place with actors and in countries outside the West. The global history of human rights needs to be written by giving due acknowledgement to all its makers. By globalizing human rights, I mean the struggles to have all nation states sign the international human rights conventions, while simultaneously making the UN truly cosmopolitan. It is local human rights associations and actors that carry out these struggles against their governments who refuse to participate in international law. By localizing human rights, I mean the translations between international and local justice systems, because justice and peace building has a chance to be effective only if it is participatory and bottom-up. The assumption of the objectivity and universality of international law has been debated because ethnographic and sociological studies have revealed that conceptions of justice among communities vary. Societies respond to violations differently. Methods that they use to find justice differ. Reconciliation means forgiveness in some countries, but punishment in others. Individual opinions about justice in a given country are skewed according to nationalist and ethnocentric ideologies. So when perceived as a toolkit that can be applied anywhere without translations, reparations or human rights activism foreclose a society's right to heal. Hence the need for localizing human rights, the need for translation. And conceiving international and local justice or UN and grassroots activisms as competitive struggles sabotages the protection of peoples. That's why I'm suggesting a much more complementary and translational processes. Human rights discourse creates solidarity between peoples who can act with a shared sense of human suffering and thereby transcend class, gender, race, geography, or other distinctions. The concept of human rights is an antidote to identity politics and the manipulation of victimhood in cases where struggles to end oppression for one group do not translate into defending others in similar situations. So with these devices to analyze space and give physical shape to human rights activism, architecture, I think, can indeed take proactive roles in globalized, localized, and open justice platform systems. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now. I see a question here. Shall I read and answer it? Okay, so this is by Serap Öztürk. Thank you for your presentation. Outside of all political, ideological, and social frameworks, how would you prefer to conceptually define the other on the scale of architectural practice or architectural design? So, I mean, obviously, there are so many definitions of the other, and non-Western has been at one point defined as the other of Western architectural practice and design. But in this particular lecture, which is like 40 minutes, I define the other as the subjects that have been subject to human rights violations. And I particularly looked at the non-citizen, the refugee, the guest worker who's, or the guest worker who is deprived of political rights, and the victim of human rights violations in the past. And obviously I gave examples of those who have been subject to enforced disappearance, whose rights Saturday mothers are asking, or those who have been subject to enforced disappearance starting in 1915 in this country. But there are obviously many others of architectural design, but these two were my examples today. So they are basically those who have been excluded from established notions of what counts as architectural history, what is beautiful, what's correct design, and so on and so forth. And as you have done in your question, I always put the other in quotation marks, meaning that there is an othering of the other. There's a racialization of the races. So we have to de-other the other. We have to include that has been who has been previously excluded. So I see another question. Also, Besgen, do the act of localizing human rights have to localize architectural space also? Yes, I mean, but of course, how to localize architectural space is very broad. I mean, I don't think one localizes architectural space only by, let's say, referring to the vernacular architecture of the region and so on. So as long as you define localizing architectural space and you open it to many different substantiated definitions, yes, I think localizing human rights will need to localize architectural space in the sense that it has to be participatory, it has to be bottom-up, it has to translate international human rights debate to its own context in a way that is substantiated, in a way that's collective and participatory. So if I'm not understanding these questions, maybe, I don't know if you can unmute yourself and ask in person, because sometimes writing is, it takes too much time. Please go ahead. So I'm just interpreting the one-line questions and trying to answer them. But if you try to ask something else, please unmute if you can, or write it again. There's a question by Serap Öztürk. Thank you again, and your answer, dear Esra Akcan. So this is a thank you note. Thank you so much. Subescan is here as far as I can see.
Hello, dear Esra Akcan. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for your presentation. The reason of my question is I wonder if the localization of human rights makes also the architectural space localized. So you said yes, and you support some or offered some concepts such as participation and so on. I'm thinking, or I'm dreaming such a localized human rights on a specific country or a place with many foreigners. For example, Turkey with many foreigners from Syria or Iran, or such as that just we are living in. So what kind of an architectural space can you imagine that should localize the space also? I couldn't imagine such a place or a space in our country or in my city, because right now we are living that, and there's really a chaos in the architectural space. They're ordering some other functions in housing spaces. For example, in Trabzon, they ask for two different kitchens in the same house, big kitchens also. And there are many examples like this.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I actually wanted two parts to this discussion, the first one being refugees on the guest workers, you know, those who were legally regarded as guest workers or immigrants in Germany, was precisely because I wanted us to notice that we can't have double standards. I mean, we can't really defend the human rights of, let's say, Turkish refugees in Germany, but then do not defend the human rights of the Syrian refugees here. So that's why I think, and the example that Berlin's Kreuzberg is a good example that can inspire us. And the local, I don't think, is the person who has lived in a place who was born in a place. I think we have to undo our traditional conception that the local is someone who was born in that space, especially in the age of global capitalism and the age of climate change. Migration will be a very, very, 21st century will be the age of migrations, because it already is, and there are more climate refugees coming because of the faults that they did not do, or political refugees. A refugee is never really is a victim. Is not, the perpetrator is someone different. The perpetrator can be the rulers of their own country, of the country that they're in, because of not having enough infrastructure, not giving enough money to the resettlement of refugees and so on. But the refugee herself is never the perpetrator. She's a victim, and a human rights defendant means protecting the rights of the victim, regardless of the fact that the victim, precisely because of the fact that the perpetrators are very strong, and the perpetrators are in Syria, in Turkey, and in the Europe, all these negotiations and so on. But the human rights defenders do not show perpetrators as an excuse. I mean, you have to defend the right of the victim. So in that sense, I would say that if the refugees are going to live here, they need to be part of the physical spaces to be designed. And the Kreuzberg example that I showed or written in my book, I think can be an inspiring example in that sense. Not in all examples, but in the fourth example that I showed today, a team of architects really subverted their employers and their government's discriminatory housing laws. So it is possible that the architects can defend the human rights of the refugee, of the victim, regardless of their government's discriminatory housing laws. So, I mean, I just had only 3 minutes today for that example, but luckily I could extend on it in a book. So I think that's a very inspiring example that we can learn from. And we can't just say Turkish refugees were subject to human rights violations in Germany, that's wrong, and do the same thing to the Syrian refugees today. So we have to, I think, defend a human rights defender should be a human rights defender, even though the situation is extremely difficult. I mean, I'm not saying it is it will be an easy solution, but I think if we give up on our principles of defending human rights, then we don't have any moral ground to stand on.
Yeah, sure.
So there's another question. Should I move to that question?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your question, and thank you for bringing it up. I mean, that's the discussion actually I wanted to have by juxtaposing these two cases, and I'm glad that it was noticed and we could have this discussion. Thank you. So Wassam Ahmed Siddiqui asks, thank you for your presentation. For some reason, while listening to you, it reminds me of the well-known quote by Marx, they cannot represent themselves, they have to be represented. Edward Said also used it in his book Orientalism. Spivak Gayatri was another post-colonial thinker who used this notion in her Can the Subaltern Speak? What do you think regarding this notion, how one should take this notion representation by encountering the other? I mean, I think the text that you have mentioned, Gayatri Spivak, Can Subaltern Speak, is a good way to think about this. And also, she notices that in contemporary theory, we actually misuse the term and misuse Marx's sentence in a way about identity. So the word representation in the language that Marx is writing in German actually has two different ways, and he's using political representation, but not representation of identity. So Spivak warns us not to confuse these two separate definitions of representation, So representing in a political sphere by voting and choosing your representative who will then be in the parliament and speak for you, that kind of representation is different from cultural representation of an identity. So these should be really separated, because when we mix them, we start falling into these identity politics, and we start reifying identities with very sharp lines, as if, I don't know, someone from Syria has these characters, someone from Turkey has these characters. This is the wrong definition of representation as a representation of identity. So Spivak warns us not to manipulate Marx's text by conflating these two definitions of representation. So that's how I would answer this question. Okay, so that was, I see no open questions.
No more questions. Thank you very much for this inspiring speech and discussion. And now we'll take a coffee break, and we'll meet again at 4:15 for the concurrent sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for your wonderful questions. And I know I cannot see you, but hopefully I will hear from you in the future. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much.